So like Simon said, my name is Melissa Barragan, and I'm a fifth year in the Criminology Law and Society program here at UCI. So I'll be talking today about my dissertation and the progress that I've made so far. So in a nutshell, my dissertation is a mixed method study that is looking at local explanations and responses to gun violence in two California cities, Richmond, which is in the Bay Area, and San Bernardino. I purposely selected these cities because they essentially serve as microcosms of local gun violence trends in the state, but at the local level. So Richmond has seen considerable decrease in gun violence over the past 10 years, which this table shows here, about 45% decrease in homicide, most of which are gun-related. And then San Bernardino has kind of stayed in this stagnating range of homicide, and they've actually seen a slight uptick, 2% in the past 10 years. But both cities have maintained gun violence rates that are anywhere between 3 to 4 times higher than the state average across that 10-year span. So as a mixed method study, I'm utilizing in-depth interviews with key stakeholders like law enforcement officials, city government officials, residents, as well as observations, census and crime data, and archival sources for my analysis. So by engaging these different types of data in my study, I'm ultimately trying to provide a more in-depth and grounded account of the local level conditions, processes, and strategies that enable stability and change in gun violence over time. So this is a snapshot of my data collection so far. I've done 82 interviews total, most of which have been in Richmond, as well as 40 observations. And these are the types of stakeholders and observations that I've done. And that's amounted to about 200 fieldwork hours. And data collection is still ongoing in San Bernardino, whereas in Richmond, I've wrapped it all up. So because I'm constrained on time, I'm only going to focus on some of my preliminary findings from Richmond. So the main question with Richmond that kind of brought me to the city is, why has gun violence gone down? And unfortunately, like any complex social phenomenon, there's no simple answer. But these themes that I've listed here are some of the salient explanations provided by my stakeholders. So the first is, compared to other cities that I've read about and now that I'm observing firsthand, like San Bernardino, Richmond really stands out in terms of how they've been able to progressively develop a multi-pronged strategy to address gun violence over the past 10 years. And it's a strategy that doesn't just rely on law enforcement or a single program or intervention, which is more typical of other cities. And so these are several of the different gun violence strategies that were started in direct response to gun violence in the city. But then there's also been several others in the past couple of years that have been started to specifically support those that might be most at risk for engaging in gun violence, like the reentry population. And stakeholders also pointed to regular community mobilization over the past 10 years. So there's been numerous grassroots efforts that have really, I think, triggered movement, not only among residents, but among city officials and leaders. And these continue, maybe not as robustly as they did a few years ago, but there's still weekly prayer walks, for example, that are organized by residents to raise awareness around gun violence. And there are some skeptics in the city in terms of whether or not these strategies have been effective. But like I said, what they seem to really have been able to do is make the issue visible and keep it visible for power actors like city officials and police. And then the last two strategies, I don't have that much time left, but law enforcement tactics. A lot of community members who are still skeptical about policing in the city have conceded to the fact that it's really changed in the past 10 years. They don't have what they call the jump out boys anymore, who would terrorize the city, pull people over, arrest them for small offenses. And they credit that to a chief that recently moved to Tucson, but also to just a more greater emphasis on community policing and narrowing the net in terms of who they target for gun and gang crime. And then the last theme is population change. So in the past 10 years, the city's flipped essentially from being majority Black to majority Latino. And it's not just a change in proportions, it's actually a change in numbers. So there's been about 38% decrease in the Black population since 2000. And this narrative is one that residents in particular feel like is a story that's not being told. Gun violence is going down, Black people are leaving, but people don't want to talk about the nexus between the two. So that's one theme that I'm going to be exploring in my dissertation. I'm out of time, but these are essentially the chapters that I'll be writing. One that focuses on how the city developed their infrastructure around gun violence reduction. One that looks at this question of demographic change and Black population loss using qualitative and quantitative data. And then the last is a longitudinal analysis of crime trends, taking into account geography and different social ecological factors. I want to thank everyone from the Newkirk Center for funding this project. I would not have been able to go to Richmond, especially without this funding. And then also my co-chairs, Kermit Ryder and George Tita, and then of course my participants in Richmond and San Bernardino. Questions? That was 6 minutes, sorry.
I have a question. Sure. What sort of, I don't want to be un-PC, but what sort of data exists that's in communities that are predominantly Black, or Hispanic, and the kind of crime, are there significant differences? There is data?
In terms of like the offenders and victims?
Well, I would pick gun violence and just say it.
Yeah, so I am going to get crime data for 17 years from the city, and that does include race of the victim and offender when known. Sometimes it's not known. But in the city of Richmond and in a lot of other urban areas, the burden typically falls on Black folks. They're more likely to be the victims as well as the perpetrators of gun violence. But in other cities like LA, you might see more of a Latino, I guess, disparity because of the way the population is. But even with the change, it's still predominantly Black in Richmond. Yeah.
Do you have any statistics on what fraction of the gun violence crimes in Richmond have been gang related? And how has that changed over time?
So I'm slowly getting the data, so I can't give you anything yet. But the estimates from law enforcement is that it's about half, and that it's been about half consistently over the years regardless. This past year that I was there, 2016, it was a little different in terms of proportion because they had some really strange one-off homicides, like a road rage killing involving guns, a couple domestic violence related homicides, drug buys gone wrong, I should say. But they don't actually, unlike some departments, they don't actually put that as a variable in their data. So it's going to be hard for me to even, I get the homicide narratives, so I'm going to be able to draw some conclusions from the actual case narratives. But in terms of a variable in their data, they don't collect it, unfortunately. Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you.